Okay, hello and welcome. My name is Mike Wood and I'm the Product Director at Once for All, a leading European compliance and supply chain management company. The company better known as Construction Line in the UK. A key part of my role is focusing on improving supply chain management and compliance. And a key aspect of that, as always, is introducing and supporting standards in the industry. So it's very exciting for me to be here today to talk to you a little bit about the latest update to the Common Assessment Standard, version 4. And joining me today to provide a little bit of background into the origins of the Common Assessment Standard and how the review process works is Paul Reeve. So Paul, welcome. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Mike. Pleasure to be here. My name is Paul Reeve, and I'm currently the chairman of the Build UK Common Assessment Standard Question Review Group.
All right, so Paul, maybe you could take us through a little bit how Build UK and the Common Assessment Standard came about, and ultimately, really, how does that benefit the industry?
Well, the Common Assessment Standard has been with us now for about 5 or 6 years, and it was developed to combat an industry problem, which was the proliferation of pre-qualification schemes. What suppliers in particular were finding is that they were being asked to fill in all sorts of questionnaires, very different questions. This was creating a real problem for them in terms of cost, but also in terms of the time that it took them to fill in these questionnaires. They were also getting confused as to what exactly they were required to do in order to meet these various standards. So the Common Assessment Standard was created under the auspices of Build UK, but with full industry support and a wide range of stakeholders to come up with one common pre-qualification question set. And it had the active support of a huge number of industry stakeholders and some key industry assessor bodies, including, of course, Construction Line, who worked together to come up with a key question set that everybody could work to and that it could be cross-recognised. And by cross-recognition, I mean that if a buyer said, I want you as a supplier to achieve the Common Assessment Standard, that buyer would not be particularly bothered or exercised as to who had provided that Common Assessment Standard assessment to the supplier. So the assessment bodies can exchange information amongst themselves, and no matter who you achieve the Common Assessment Standard through, your buyer should be in a position to recognise and accept that you've passed to that standard.
Okay, that sounds excellent. So, I mean, I know from the early days, almost as you say 5 years ago, this has gone from strength to strength, and the number of buyers that are supporting the Common Assessment Standard has now increased manyfold from the kind of original group that got it off the ground. But I think, saving time and money has got to be something that everybody's interested in across the industry. That's, I think, got to be a good thing.
Absolutely. And I think in addition to saving time and money and basically reducing duplication of effort across the industry, what the Common Assessment Standard now does is it provides an industry recognised, if you like, checklist of what good looks like for the industry. Anybody in the industry can go to the Build UK website or talk to their recognised assessment body, such as Construction Line, and say, show me the questions, please. And those questions are pretty much defining what good looks like in the construction industry. So that's extremely useful for the industry.
And we'll come on to it in a minute, but obviously the role of the review body is crucial in ensuring that the Common Assessment Standard actually keeps pace with changes. We know that the construction industry is generally a fast-moving industry with lots and lots of changes, not least the Building Safety Act, and the ability of the Common Assessment Standard through the process of the review body to react and kind of get those into the Common Assessment Standard is a real benefit, I think, to improving the overall compliance in the industry.
Well, I'd agree. I think the role of the Build UK review group is absolutely essential, and they take their role very, very seriously. And the role is made up of 2 key parts. The first is to come up with a Common Assessment Standard which provides buyer assurance, general buyer assurance at the pre-qualification level, so that buyers know that suppliers who have Common Assessment Standard certification meet the standard of good. They're good in the industry. They're not necessarily Best practice, if you've got best practice, put it in your common assessment standard assessment, by all means. But it's looking for good, not necessarily best, because best can't be applied to everybody, but good is what everyone should do. That's the first thing, is assurance for buyers. But the second thing is we take it very seriously within the review group that we realise that this is being deployed in the field. It's being deployed with suppliers, and suppliers deserve clear, consistent, concise questions which are relevant to what they do. So, for example, there are some exceptions if it is not relevant to you. You don't have to fill in every single question if some of it does not apply to what you actually do. There are some exemptions in some areas for very small businesses as well. We're not looking to make the Common Assessment Standard difficult in terms of how you engage with it. The challenge for the Common Assessment Standard is, as a supplier, is these are what the industry want to see from me, these things, and we'll talk about those a bit later, what those various things might look like. My challenge is, do I meet those standards? It isn't, do I understand the question? We're looking to make sure that every year when we review the Common Assessment Standard, it's clear, concise, and easy to understand.
Okay, so we've recently concluded the most recent review panel. This one actually took a little bit longer than previous ones because there've been a number of big changes in the industry, not least obviously the release of the Hackett report and the changes that came off the back of that in the Building Safety Act, but also the withdrawal of PAS 91, which has been kind of a key cornerstone of assessment and the common assessment within the construction industry for many, many years. So we've now got version 4. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what's gone into that.
Of course. So version 4 was a very significant revision effort, as you mentioned earlier. Again, we started by looking at, are there any questions we can remove as events moved on to the extent that some of these questions don't make sense anymore. Anything like that, there was an inefficient way of asking suppliers what they're doing, we've removed. And we're always very keen, if we can, to remove questions without lowering standards. But the most important development in version 4 by a country mile is the introduction of building safety regulatory questions. And these questions are basically asking what's known as duty holders, and by that I mean contractors, principal contractors, designers and principal designers in particular. What are you going to do to comply with new regulations, which I say new, they were introduced in October 2023, but they're still bedding in within the industry, which require you now to show how you will help to ensure compliance with building regulation and building standards. And it's a very important point to note that the questions that we're asking have been drawn from those regulations. It's what I said earlier about making sure that we're looking for good, not necessarily best, although if people have got best, by all means show it. But good, in this case, equals legal compliance. And the legal compliance comes from those October 2023 regulations. So there's no gold plating in these questions that are now in the Common Assessment Standard. But they're very important questions indeed, because if you think the Grenfell report, the second report, only came out around 2 weeks ago in this country, everybody knows the importance of getting building safety right from this point on. Everybody in the industry should be invested in making sure that happens. And these regulations are part of the solution to that. They're basically saying to everybody in the industry, whether or not you work on higher risk buildings, it doesn't matter. If you work on any building at all in the UK from here on, and certainly in England and Wales to begin with, because this legislation will spread eventually throughout the rest of the UK, you have to show competency, the ability to communicate effectively on site. You have to make sure that you can help to ensure if there's anything that's happening that isn't compliant with building standards, that if effectively you tell the principal contractor that something's not quite right. Basically, you have to play your part now in maintaining standards on site. And that's what this new question set is looking for, is do you have the organisational capability to help to deliver effectively safe buildings for occupants? So this isn't the same as health and safety. There's another question set in the Common Assessment Standard for occupational health and safety. In other words, how do you build on site or maintain on site in safety for your workforce and others? This is about ensuring that the building is constructed or maintained in a way that ensures the safety of occupants now and into the future. So it's a very, very significant question set, and it was introduced in version 4, and we're now looking forward to hearing from the industry when they look at these questions. Do these questions work for you? Can you respond to these questions effectively as part of your Common Assessment Standard response?
One quick question though for some people who may be watching is, well, what happens if I actually don't do something that falls within the remit of the Building Safety Act? How am I going to respond to those questions? Is there any way that I can have an exemption?
Yes, there's an exemption at the top of the Building Safety Regulatory Questions section, which asks you if you are carrying out work which is in scope of the Building Safety Act and its regulations or not. If you believe that you will never do that sort of work. So I'll give you an example. You may be doing just ground works, arboriculture, gardening work, this not necessarily connected to buildings at all. Now, if that's all you do, most of the Building Safety Act, if not all of it, will never apply to you. The things that it requires you to do, there's a really good chance they won't apply. So if that's what you do, you say that and you're then exempt from that question set. But you have to be very careful if you do seek that exemption, because it means you should never engage in that work at all unless you have gone through the Common Assessment Standard again and been assessed under that scope. These questions are looking for legal compliance, and if someone says they don't feel they're covered by those legal requirements, then they have to think very carefully, am I ever going to be doing that sort of work or not?
So that Building Safety Act section that's being introduced to the new Common Assessment Standard, the Construction Line Gold, probably from September, October 2024, is going to be advisory for at least the initial 6 months. Maybe you could give us a little background as to the decision that led to it being made advisory and what we're hoping to learn as an industry, as an assessment body, and as Build UK over that period.
Of course. So I think it's very important, first of all, to clarify what we mean by an advisory question in the Common Assessment Standard. Some people might think advisory means optional, but it doesn't actually mean that in the basic sense of the word. And I'll explain what I mean by that. When someone says, oh, here's a question and it's optional, then that implies that you have an option to either answer it or not. With the advisory, what it means is this question, no matter what you put in as a response, will not at the moment affect your ability to obtain the Common Assessment Standard, provided you can ask all the other questions to a standard that's required. However, buyers will see your response to your advisory question. So it's actually quite advisable to give your best efforts to answer the question, at least to the extent that you can, hopefully to a good extent. But even if you're struggling at the moment with that question, you're not quite used to it, or you've never seen anything like that before, put in what you can, give it your best effort, because buyers will still see the answer to your advisory question. In time, these questions are very likely to become mandatory questions, however, and the reason that is the case is because, as mentioned earlier, all of the building safety regulatory questions that are in the Common Assessment Standard now are based on legislation already. Normally, they would be mandatory questions because of that reason. But we have decided, talking with colleagues in the industry and consulting widely, that until at least the new year, 2025, January 2025, we'll make them advisory, because we still feel that many in the industry are getting used to these building safety regulatory questions. They're not always confident what to say. They may not have the full systems in place to answer all the questions yet, and we do not want to compromise their ability to pass the Common Assessment Standard unnecessarily. However, the very fact that these questions are now in this Common Assessment Standard, whether or not they're advisory, is a huge flag up to the industry that this is what the industry is looking for and this is what the regulations are looking for.
Okay, so that sounds like we've got a sensible, practical approach to introducing something that's, let's be fair, is going to be fairly new and perhaps in some cases quite difficult for some suppliers to actually respond to. But the fact that it's going to be in there as advisory is going to allow them to start to respond and indeed to get feedback from assessors like Construction Line as to what is required and how they can improve themselves. And I guess hopefully overall what we're looking to do is just raise the bar across the industry as a whole, so that in 6 months' time, or however long it takes before we actually make these mandatory, everybody should be expected to be able to achieve that standard.
Absolutely. And what will happen in the new year is that we can look at the responses of the industry, the suppliers in the industry, to these advisory questions, and through the recognised assessment bodies such as Construction Line and others, we can gather data which will tell us which of those questions did they find were easy to answer, and which of them did they find more challenging to answer. And where obviously there's more challenge, it won't be necessarily a case of changing the question, although it might be to rephrase it slightly differently, who knows, bearing in mind they're based on the legislation though. But more likely what it will do is it will enable people to produce useful, relevant guidance to suppliers on how to cost effectively, if you like, comply with that question. What is that question really asking for, and what sort of things do you need to do in order to provide compliance with it?
Okay, so the recommendation is don't wait, actually start to have a look at those questions, start submitting your responses, and then only through that process you're actually going to learn about what's required and how easy or not is it going to be.
If I could give one piece of advice to our viewers on this subject, is please don't be a stranger to the Common Assessment Standard. Go and have a look right away what these new questions are asking, indeed the whole of the standard. Make sure you're familiar with what the questions are asking. And then there's a 3-step process which I'd ask everybody to consider for their own good. Do you understand what these questions are asking you? That's the first one. And we'll talk about what happens if you don't in a moment. But assuming you understand, think about what have you got in place at the moment. It's very important to point out that the Common Assessment Standard regulatory questions that have been introduced, they're really not trying to introduce things that should be new for the industry. We know that a lot of good companies out there are already doing the things that are in the new building safety regulatory regime. But we know from disasters such as Grenfell that there are a lot of suppliers out there who are not doing all of these things. The regulations are there to bring everybody up to meet that standard, to get over that basic bar. So when you look at those questions, do I understand them? How close am I to complying already? Where are my gaps? How do I fill those gaps in pretty quick? Because very soon these questions may be mandatory. When they become mandatory, if I can't respond to them satisfactorily when I'm being assessed, that's going to jeopardize my ability to even achieve the Common Assessment Standard, which is a gateway to work in the industry now. If you're having problems with any of those issues, either understanding the questions or knowing how to fill the gaps, my advice would be talk as quickly as you can to your trade association, if you have one. And if you haven't got one, you might want to think about joining a trade association, because that's what they exist to do, is to help you to get to the right standard in the industry. If you've got a problem with the questions, you think they may be irrelevant, or you don't understand why they're asking that question in that way, please flag up as quick as possible to Construction Line or to your other assessment body, or to Build UK, your concerns, your issues, suggestions, any feedback at all. Because we want to hear from the industry how they're experiencing these new questions, so that we can make sure that they achieve the right standard, but they achieve it in a way that's really helpful to the industry. And for that, we need people's feedback. So please don't ignore the Common Assessment Standard thinking it might go away. Have a look as soon as possible. And if you've got any issues, raise them with people who are there to help you and listen to you as soon as possible.
Okay. So, I think it's fair to say, and you touched upon it at the beginning, that the Common Assessment Standard is a gateway, ultimately, to helping suppliers inform contractors, buyers that they're going to work with, that they have all the necessary skills, qualifications, etc., to actually work on the projects. Ultimately, it should help them reduce the additional overhead of providing all the information that they've previously had to provide multiple times in the past.
The Common Assessment Standard has been designed with 2 aims in mind: one, to provide buyer assurance, but secondly, to allow suppliers to provide that assurance in the most cost-effective way available. It's an industry solution. Going forward, I believe it will become more and more prevalent within the industry. And in April 2024, it is now specified for public sector major procurement projects. So that broadens it out now into the public sector as well, which means that it's not just for new build and new construction, but also increasingly will be applied to buyers who want contractors and other suppliers for maintenance and other service projects.
Well, that's great. Thank you for joining us today, Paul. I can only say a huge thank you for sharing your insight and experience of the Common Assessment Standard, and hopefully what we've covered today is going to be of use and help those people that are either beginning their journey on the Common Assessment Standard or are going to start their journey around the new Building Safety Act to kind of embrace that with a little bit more confidence. So thank you.
Thank you.